I want to ask you about something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I think we're seeing play out. And there's old adage like if there's shared responsibility, nobody's responsible. And the CSPs have really sold on this shared security responsibility model. I guess kind of two questions. The first question is like, how did you merge or meet that kind of model at Netflix? Because AWS would clearly say, hey, we're responsible for X, Y, and Z, and you're responsible for the rest. And then just to prep you, like, I think the second question is, we're seeing this in SaaS and we're seeing this like in PaaS too, right? And most recent Snowflake incident where it's like, hey, we're responsible for X, you're responsible for Y, you didn't do Y correctly, that's why this happened. Now Paul and I are seeing this in organizations too, right? Specific to identity, where, hey, identity management is the responsibility of IT and threat detection is the responsibility of security. And then there's this gap. So there's this shared understanding, and then the threat actors they love shared responsibility models. That's my feeling, at least. So I just kind of generally, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I generally am a fan of the idea of being clear about responsibilities. So I totally agree. If you're not clear and explicit about who needs to do what, you're going to fail. So I think the problem is that that's an ideal, right? The ideal is that, say there's 100 things to do, and I'm gonna do these 50. You're gonna do those 50. The problem is, like, we don't actually have that kind of clear articulation of the very specifics that need to happen. So I think if we use the Snowflake incident as an example, it's like, does the customer of Snowflake have the responsibility to configure, strong authentication? Sure. But Snowflake as the vendor, they're the ones that see logins across however many thousands of customers, right? They're the ones who are in the best position to be able to detect things like credential stuffing, right? So I don't know what sort of logging that Snowflake has available to the customer, but clearly Snowflake as the provider can see that. So if they're not able to sort of, I would say, not just see that, but they have to operationalize it, right? They need to be able to take that information and then make it available to their customers so that they can do something about it. So it's tough. I would say we're still early. I think we're still early as an overall industry, and we're certainly still early in terms of shared responsibility. But yeah, I think it's the right model because that's kind of what cloud is sort of founded on, right? It's like, we're going to let you handle, the data center and the physical, security and the networking and all that stuff, and we're going to focus on what makes the business unique. So that's kind of, to me, is the general cloud model. So my sense is like the security model has to follow that. I just think that it takes some tuning and it takes explicitness, and until we get there, there's probably going to remain a little bit of fuzziness. So.
Yeah, I think what's been cool is, AWS being one of the earliest players, you've seen how they've had to evolve their shared responsibility model, right? To your point, like originally it was like these hard lines around, we're going to do this stuff and you're responsible for this. They realized customers were shooting themselves in the foot because it was difficult for them to manage or maintain their part of the shared responsibility model. So they started doing things, right? Like, hey, there's unusual spend here. We noticed the key was leaked. We're going to put a policy on it. So it was hey, we're going to try to protect you a little bit. You need to take your part of the shared responsibility a little bit more seriously. So I think anybody who's a PaaS or SaaS vendor, they probably should flex a little bit out of that and not be so hard line. To your point, right? If you have universal visibility across your customer base, you're going to be able to see or detect things that an individual customer might not be able to do. And so I think we're going to probably expect that more out of vendors going forward.
Yeah, I think the example you provide is perfect, right? The whole, hey, your key was leaked, right? So it's not effective or efficient for every customer out there to scan every single, every GitHub repo and every commit. But AWS can do that and they can notify. So, but I think if you're not explicit about what you're going to do and what you're going to look for, then that's what creates the confusion. So if you say, oh, the customer is responsible for this type of response, but the customer doesn't have that visibility, then like I would always say, like, just generally, and this is also part of my, I think, general security philosophy, where I'm like, I'm never was a fan of like making developers security experts, right? Because I just don't think you could make people responsible for subject matters that they don't have expertise in. Like, how do you do that? Like, how am I going to tell somebody, security is your number one priority? you have to make the right decisions when that's not your background and like that's not what you're hired for, right? Like to me, that just when I kind of look same thing. Like if you're going to the cloud because you want specialization and you want focus, why are you going to do the exact opposite internally, right? Why aren't you going to let your developers focus on what they're hired to do? So, but I think sort of bundled into that is that idea of explicitness. Like, if we are going to have this kind of separation of duties, we've got to be really clear about what I can do, what you're going to do, and how do those, whenever it is gray, how are we going to handle that kind of negotiation, and
Mhm.
how do we get to, sort of a better future?
Yeah, it's interesting though in terms of like the visibility piece because as we've started to grow, you start to see that different vendors are very inconsistent in the visibility that they provide to their customers. And even then, some of them charge it as a premium add-on where, okay, well, you need more visibility. Like, I'm going to charge you X amount of dollars more for that, which to me seems like that should be the base expectation is, look, there is some basic visibility that we need. We understand, okay, here's what's happening in our environment, and here's the things that we need to know, and certain questions that we need to be able to answer. And a lot of those, unfortunately, in those cases, they were due to breaches or incidents, right? And so, of course, we're there with the customer trying to reconstruct what happened, and then you're starting to learn, like, oh, XYZ vendors, like we got to pay, another $30,000 to get this visibility, and some of it, even on the AWS side, is cost prohibitive for some of our customers. You're getting charged a couple $100,000 to get the data plane logging, like that doesn't make sense, like economically. So it's definitely, I think, an inconsistent implementation in the ecosystem. And I almost feel like this is what I was dealing with SOAR, with the orchestration side. I was like, some had good API documentation, and some APIs were very well developed, and some were just hacked together, and someone put it into some 2-page document, and they said, "Oh, here's our API documentation." So it kind of feels like that's where we are in this current model with SaaS vendors, even IaaS, PaaS vendors. So it's interesting to see where if that'll evolve in the next couple of years because of the pressure, I think, mostly from some of the incidents that have occurred, and customers getting pretty pissed off, I think, frankly, for getting visibility that they think they should be getting already today. So that's an interesting one.